Montana Territory, July 1879, the first time Dalton Kersey saw her. She was dragging a half-limp mule behind her through the dust of the Bitterroot Valley, her face hidden beneath the brim of a sweat-stained hat, her arm wrapped in a torn shawl despite the heat. He had just stepped outside the saloon in Darby, wiping the back of his neck with a handkerchief when she passed silent, eyes fixed forward, the mule coughing behind her. People stopped and stared. A few whispered. One man spat near her boots. "She should have stayed gone," someone muttered behind Dalton. "That's what happens when you come back looking like that." Dalton looked again. The woman's left cheek was puckered with a scar that ran down past her jaw, disappearing beneath her collar. Her right hand, gripping the mule's rope, was missing 2 fingers, but her spine was straight, her pace steady. She did not flinch when someone called her shameful. "Who is she?" Dalton asked the stableman beside him. "Delaney Judd," the man said, "used to live out past the ridge. Went off 2 years ago after the house fire. Folks thought she died. Guess she didn't." Dalton watched her walk all the way down Main Street and vanish into the trees beyond town. That night he could not sleep. The next morning he saddled his gelding and rode west toward the ridge. He told himself it was curiosity, maybe a little kindness. But when he found her cabin half burned, the roof patched with mismatched planks, and saw her kneeling in the dirt garden with her sleeves rolled up and soot still smudged across her jaw, it was not curiosity he felt. It was something sharp and quiet like hope. He dismounted. "You need help with that fence." Delaney stood slowly. Her eyes were amber, steady. "I do not have money to pay anyone." "Good thing I did not ask for any," Dalton said, and set to work. She let him stay through supper. They ate rabbit stew by lantern light, and he noticed the way she kept her left side turned away from him. Her voice was soft but sure. She asked nothing of him, offered no explanations. It made him want to stay longer. Over the next week he did keep coming back. He brought nails, a hammer, a new pair of boots she never thanked him for but always wore. And one late afternoon, when he found her with her trembling arms buried elbow-deep in soil beside a crying child, everything changed. The boy looked no older than 4, with a mop of brown hair and red cheeks streaked with tears. Delaney was trying to soothe him, but her hands were shaking. "He fell," she said without looking up. "Split his chin open on the step." Dalton crouched beside them. "What is his name?" "Bennett," she said. "My son." Dalton pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, pressed it gently to the boy's chin. "It is not too bad. I have seen worse." Delaney's jaw tightened. "He has no father, and I am not good with blood." Dalton saw it then beneath her strength, the fear. "Not for herself, for her son. You are doing fine," he said. "But let me help just for a minute." She nodded, eyes glossy. Later, after the boy had fallen asleep on a pile of quilts, Delaney stood at the stove, her back to Dalton. The light from the lantern caught the scars on her neck where her blouse slipped down. He could see how deep they ran. He knew better than to ask, but she spoke first. "I carried him out through the fire," she said quietly. "My baby. I wrapped him in my shawl, covered his face. I could not save my mother or the house, but I saved him." Dalton walked over and stood beside her. "They said I should have died too when I came back. They called me a ghost. Or worse." He looked at her, really looked. The scars across her cheek, her wrist, her hands, they were not ugly, they were proof. "You are not shameful," he said. "You are the bravest woman I have ever met." Delaney turned to him, something raw in her gaze. "Do not lie to me, Mr. Kersey." "I do not lie," he said. "And it is Dalton." She blinked. Then she whispered, "Delaney." That night, as he left the cabin and mounted his horse, he looked back once. She was standing in the doorway, her son asleep inside, her hair loose around her shoulders. The wind caught her shawl, revealing the long scar down her collarbone. He did not look away. He came back every day after that, not for the fence, not for the stew, for her, and she let him. One evening, just before sundown, Delaney was sitting on the porch steps, shelling peas into a tin bowl. Dalton sat beside her, close enough to feel the heat of her shoulder. "You ever kiss a scar before?" she asked suddenly, her eyes on the horizon. Dalton turned slowly. "No." She looked at him. Would you?" He did not speak. He leaned in, cupped her jaw gently, and pressed his lips to the scar on her cheek, then another on her neck, then the one on the back of her hand. When he pulled back, her eyes shimmered. "You do not flinch," she whispered. "Neither do you," he said, and then, for the first time, she smiled. A real one. She kissed him back, not careful, not timid. Like she had waited years to feel wanted again. Dalton wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. She gasped softly, burying her face in his shoulder, and for the first time in years, Delaney Judd let herself be held. She was not a ghost, she was a woman. And he loved her. By the time August settled into the valley, Dalton had moved his tools to a corner of Delaney's shed. The cabin's porch was sound now. The patched roof no longer moaned in the wind, and Bennett had taken to following Dalton everywhere, clutching his little tin horse and asking questions about how to ride and how to shoot, and why Dalton's boots made that sound when he walked. Delaney watched them one morning, her hands deep in a bucket of washing water, as Dalton knelt in the dirt showing Bennett how to tie a proper hitch knot. Bennett's brow was furrowed with serious purpose, his small fingers fumbling. Dalton corrected him gently, never once raising his voice. When he finally got it right, Bennett looked toward her, beaming. "Mama, look what I done," she nodded, smiled faintly. "I see it." After the boy scampered off toward the barn, Dalton straightened and dusted off his knees. "He's sharp," he said, walking over to the wash basin. "Quick hands." Delaney wrung out a shirt and draped it over the line. "He's stubborn, won't sleep unless he hears the crickets." Dalton leaned against the post near her. "You get any rest yourself?" "I rest when chores are done, when he's safe. When I'm not waiting for the roof to leak or the hens to go missing again. Let me take you and Bennett fishing tomorrow. You ever been out along the South Fork?" She glanced at him. "I haven't left this ridge since I came back. I'll bring the wagon, no rush." "You can bring your basket." She studied his face, then nodded once. "He's never seen a river." That night she laid out Bennett's best shirt, the one with the wooden buttons. She mended the cuff by lamplight while he slept beside her, cheeks flushed with sun. When she finished, she folded it carefully and set it on the stool by the door. The next morning, Dalton arrived before the heat. The wagon was plain but sturdy, the bench cleaned off for her. He wore a clean shirt, sleeves rolled, hat pulled low. Delaney lifted Bennett into the back and climbed up beside Dalton without hesitation. The ride was quiet at first. Not tense, just full of unspoken things. The kind that didn't need saying but hung between them like dust in a sunbeam. Dalton guided the horses along a narrow trail through the trees, the pine scent thick and sharp. When the river came into view, Bennett gasped and stood up in the wagon bed. "It's so big." Delaney caught his sleeve gently. "Sit down, sweetheart." Dalton pulled them up beside a willow bank and tied the horses. "We'll fish farther down, water's slow there." They walked single file through the brush, Bennett chattering about frogs and minnows. Delaney carried the basket, Dalton the poles. When they reached the clearing, the boy ran ahead, shoes kicking up soft sand. Delaney stood still for a moment, eyes on the water. Dalton watched her. "You all right?" "I never thought I'd see a place like this again." She knelt slowly, ran her hand through the shallows. "It's warm." He sat beside her. "Let him get his feet wet. River's gentle here." She nodded, watching Bennett splash and giggle in his rolled-up trousers. They fished through the morning. Bennett caught nothing but happiness. Dalton caught 2 trout and grinned like a boy himself when the second one flopped in the grass. Delaney laughed, a low, surprised sound, and he turned toward her, caught off guard by how much he liked hearing it. "You're good at that," she said. He shrugged. "My pa taught me." "Said a man who can feed himself don't need to beg." Delaney's smile faded. "My father never stayed long enough to teach me anything." Dalton didn't ask more. He passed her the rod. "Try this one." Her hands were unsure at first, but he didn't reach to correct her. He waited, let her find her own rhythm. Later, while Bennett napped on a folded blanket, they sat beneath the willow, sharing dried peaches and cornbread. A breeze stirred the leaves above them, soft and slow. Dalton rested an elbow on his knee. "You ever think about leaving this place?" She looked at the hills beyond the river. I used to dream about it, before. And now, she turned to him, now I think about building something better than what burned. Dalton was quiet a long time. Then he said, you already have. She looked away, jaw tight. He reached for her hand, careful, and she let him take it. The silence between them wasn't heavy now. It was full of something steady, like trust. When they made their way back to the wagon, Bennett asleep on Dalton's shoulder, Delaney walked beside them, not trailing behind. She didn't ask what came next, and neither did he. But when he helped her down from the wagon that evening, her hand lingered in his. And when she turned to go, she said, you'll stay for supper, he nodded. If there's room at the table. There's room, she said. There's always room. September brought the hush of oncoming cold. The wind shifted, dry leaves scraping across the porch in the evenings. Delaney had begun pulling Bennett's blanket tighter at night, stitching patches into his trousers by lantern glow when he outgrew the knees faster than she could follow. Dalton had started sleeping in the lean-to beside the shed, unasked, but not unwelcome. He brought his own wool quilt and a cedar trunk full of tools, and when it rained, Delaney left a bowl of beans and bread on the stoop without saying a word. One morning, while Bennett played with a bent spoon in the chicken yard, Delaney knelt beside a water barrel, scrubbing the last of the summer grime from her boots. Dalton walked up, carrying a coil of rope and a canvas sack. I'm heading out toward the old timber trail, he said. Saw some downed trees last week. Good for firewood if we want to get through winter without burning the bedposts. She rinsed the suds from her hands, then wiped them dry on her skirt. You want company, he shrugged. Only if you're of a mind to argue about which trees are worth dragging. She picked up her hat from the porch rail. I'll find someone to keep Bennett. We can be back by sundown. The ride was quiet through the thickest part of the woods, the horses mindful of their weight. Dalton led the way, reins loose, his hat pulled low against the pale sun. Delaney followed, her eyes scanning the trees, still half expecting the woods to turn on her like they had once before, when smoke had chased her through their shadows. At one point, Dalton glanced back. You ever split logs before? Not properly. Well, you'll be better at it than I was my first go. Broke the axe handle clean through. My uncle made me carve the next one myself. Delaney gave a faint snort. You stayed with kinfolk then, for a while. After my older brother got himself caught in a cattle stampede, I left Texas. There wasn't much left to stay for. She didn't press, and he didn't offer more. They didn't need to. Some hurts lived quiet between people who understood them. When they reached the clearing, Delaney rolled up her sleeves and helped him strip bark from a long pine trunk. Her hands were calloused from years of work, but the axe was heavier than she expected. Dalton showed her how to grip it lower, how to let gravity do the labor. You try to muscle through it, you'll wear yourself out, he said, guiding her hands without touching them. Let the swing carry, she nodded, tried again. The blade bit deep. A clean sound rang through the air. They worked until their backs ached and the sun had dropped halfway behind the ridge. Then Dalton set down the axe and sat on a stump, breathing slow. Delaney joined him, wiping sweat from her brow with a fold of skirt. He reached into the sack, pulled out a strip of dried meat and passed it to her. I meant to say something the other day, he said. That stew you made last week tasted like something out of a kitchen with marble floors. She raised an eyebrow. You ever eat in a house with marble floors? No, he said, tearing a piece for himself. But I've seen one from the outside. She laughed, and the sound startled a jay from a nearby branch. They sat there a while, chewing in companionable silence, the kind that didn't need filling. After a bit, Dalton leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I was thinking, he said. This place your land, the house you've done a damn fine job keeping it together, but winter's long. And there's things two hands can't manage alone. Delaney turned toward him, her expression unreadable. Are you asking to stay through the freeze? He met her eyes. I'm asking if it would trouble you if I did. She took her time answering. It would only trouble me if you left come spring. She didn't look away when she said it. Dalton's gaze softened. Then I'll stay. That night, After they'd hauled 2 cords of wood back and Bennett had fallen asleep curled against the hearth, Delaney stood in the doorway watching the trees sway under a hunter's moon. Dalton came up behind her, slow and sure, a blanket around his shoulders. She didn't move when he reached for her hand. "You still carry the fire in you," he said, voice low, "but it's not burning you anymore." She turned toward him. "It still flares up. Some nights I wake with the smell of smoke in my nose." He brought her hand to his chest, holding it there. "Then let me be the water that keeps it from taking you under." She studied his face in the pale light, searching for exaggeration. There was none. "Come inside," she said, voice hushed. "There's warmth enough for both of us." And when they crossed the threshold together, it was not out of urgency. It was out of something earned, something whole. He kissed her then, not like a man taking, but like one giving back what had been stolen. He kissed the scars without hesitation, without pity. Each one a story, each one a proof of her survival. Delaney didn't cry. She let herself be seen. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she had to hide. The first frost came early. By mid-October, the creek behind the cabin wore a skin of ice each morning, delicate as glass. Dalton had chopped enough wood to last through March, stacking it along the north wall where the wind couldn't steal the warmth from it. Delaney had sealed the windows with strips of oiled cloth and lined Bennett's bed with an extra quilt stitched from old flannel shirts. One morning, after tending the stove and dressing Bennett for a neighbor's visit, Delaney lingered at the table while Dalton tied a bundle of dried sage with twine. She watched his hands, the way he worked quietly with purpose. He wore a wool vest and the sleeves of his shirt were rolled to his elbows, one forearm marked with a pale ridge of scar that hadn't been there in August. "I don't remember you having that," she said, nodding to it. He glanced down. "That one's from back in Kansas. Got caught under a wagon tongue when I was helping a family out of a ditch. Rain, slick road, axle snapped." She leaned forward a little. "They all make a story, don't they, the ones that stay?" He looked up. "Some more worth keeping than others." She traced the grain of the tabletop with her fingertip. "Do you ever wish you'd settled somewhere else?" Dalton shook his head. "I came west looking for quiet, thought it meant being alone. Turns out it just meant being somewhere I could hear myself think." Delaney smiled faintly. "And now," he shrugged, "now I think better with Bennett talking my ear off and your bread in the oven." She looked toward the door. "He'll be at Grace's until dusk." She offered to teach him how to make apple preserves. Dalton tied off the last knot and set the sage aside. "That mean we've got the house to ourselves?" She stood. "It does." They spent the morning cleaning the root cellar. Dalton hauled the crates while Delaney sorted through jars, holding each one to the light to check for cracks. Dust clung to their clothes, and the air turned damp as they worked deeper into the stone-lined chamber. As she reached for a crock on the highest shelf, her blouse pulled tight across her back, revealing a line of puckered skin that ran from shoulder blade to waist. Dalton didn't speak. But when she turned around, he was watching her with a look she hadn't seen before, not hunger, not pity. Something reverent. She leaned back against the cool stone wall. "You want to ask about it?" "No," he said simply. "I want to know if you remember the first time someone called you shameful." She hesitated. "A woman in town, first day I came back. She said I looked like the devil had chewed me up and left just enough to recognize." Dalton stepped closer. "And what did you say?" "I didn't." Her voice was low. "I just kept walking." He lifted her hand, the one with the missing fingers, and kissed the space between each knuckle, slow and unhurried. Then he followed the line of her wrist, up to where the faded edge of a burn disappeared beneath her sleeve. She swallowed. "You're not afraid of what's left," he held her gaze. "What's left is the strongest thing I've ever known." There was no rush in the way he touched her, no haste to claim, just steadiness. She let her blouse fall from one shoulder, revealing the deep scar that ran along her collarbone. He didn't ask how it happened. He bent instead and kissed the length of it from edge to edge as if sealing a promise. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing pine needles against the window panes. Inside, they moved together like two people who had already chosen who weren't uncertain or unfinished. Later, as they sat at the hearth, a pot of lentils simmering between them, Delaney broke the silence. "You ever think about what kind of man stays when things aren't easy?" Dalton reached for her hand again, lacing his fingers with the ones she still had. "I think he's the one who knows something hard-earned is worth keeping." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they listened to the fire pop and shift. When Bennett returned, cheeks pink from the cold and a jar of apple preserves clutched in both hands, Dalton opened the door and crouched to greet him, brushing snow from the boy's coat. "You bring anything for me in that jar?" he asked. Bennett grinned. "Miss Grace says you have to ask Mama." Delaney took the jar, inspecting it like it was gold. "Well, I suppose if you help me wash up after supper, I might let you have a spoonful." Dalton winked at Bennett. "Best trade I've heard today." That night, after the boy was tucked under his quilt and the house had gone still, Delaney stepped out onto the porch, wrapping her shawl tight. Dalton followed, bringing a second blanket. They stood side by side in the cold, watching frost gather on the fence rails. She reached for his hand. "You know," she said, voice soft, "I used to think I had to hide all the broken things, had to keep quiet, keep small." He turned to her. "You don't have to do that anymore." "I know," she said, "because you see all of me." "And you still stayed." He leaned in and kissed her forehead, then her temple, then the soft place just below her ear. "I didn't stay," he whispered. "I arrived, and there beneath the stars, the wind brushing the last leaves from the trees, Delaney Judd breathed deep. She was not hidden. She was not alone. She was home. By late November, the snow had come in earnest. Not the early flurries that scattered and melted by midday, but a thick, soft fall that blanketed the ridges and softened every sound. The cabin stood warm against it, smoke curling from the chimney, its windows glowing amber with firelight come dusk. Dalton had finished reinforcing the barn roof with salvaged planks from a neighbor's collapsed shed. He came in late that afternoon, dusted with sawdust and snow, boots heavy, hands raw from the cold. Delaney met him at the door with a basin of warm water and a dry shirt folded over her arm. "You'll lose a finger if you don't thaw out," she said, setting the basin by the hearth. Dalton didn't argue. He sat on the stool, boots steaming by the fire. Delaney knelt and unwrapped the cloth from his hands, dipping them into the water and drying them gently with clean linen. Her touch was firm, without fuss, but he noticed how she lingered a moment longer than she needed to. He watched her face. "Do you ever think about what you'd be doing now if the fire hadn't happened?" Delaney didn't look up. "Sometimes, but it's like trying to picture a road that never got built. You can imagine it, but you'll never walk it." Dalton nodded slowly. "You've built a damn fine road here." She met his eyes. "I didn't build it alone." The next day, they made the journey to town to meet with the circuit preacher. Snow had crusted the ruts along the trail, and Bennett rode bundled in blankets between them on the wagon bench, humming tunelessly to himself. Delaney wore a wool dress she hadn't touched since her mother's burial, its hem let out and sleeves restitched. Dalton's collar was pressed flat, and he'd shaved before sunrise, though he nicked his jaw in the process. Inside the small clapboard church, the preacher waited with a ledger and a kettle of weak coffee. He didn't ask questions. He'd seen plenty of folks come through with bruised pasts and hard-earned vows. He simply opened his book and said, "You ready?" Delaney glanced at Dalton. "We are." Afterward, they walked back to the wagon slowly. The snow had stilled the town, muffling even the sound of the bell above the general store. Bennett held Dalton's hand, swinging their arms as he skipped through the drifts. Delaney paused before climbing up. "I don't need a ring," she said softly. "But I'll wear your name." Dalton touched her cheek, thumb brushing the faint ridge near her jaw. "You've had it since the first time I saw you walk through the dust with that mule. You just didn't know it yet." They rode home in silence, the kind that felt like shelter. That night, they hung a string of dried apples above the hearth, and Delaney set 3 plates on the table without thinking twice. Winter deepened. The days grew shorter, the nights quieter. Bennett learned to write his name with a stub of pencil Dalton whittled down for him. He practiced it every morning on scraps of paper Delaney saved from old ledgers. Sometimes, he'd ask Dalton how to spell words like home or warm or mama, and Delaney would pretend not to listen, though her hands would still in the kneading bowl when she heard. One cold morning, just before the year turned, they received a letter by courier Grace's husband had taken a bad fall while mending fence, and she needed help with chores until he found his footing again. Without hesitation, Delaney bundled Bennett and rode out with Dalton, tools packed in the wagon bed. They stayed 3 days, sleeping in the loft above the kitchen, taking turns watching Bennett while the other worked. On the third night, Delaney and Dalton sat on the porch of Grace's house with mugs of boiled chicory, watching the wind scatter powder across the frozen yard. Dalton turned toward her. "You regret any part of this?" Delaney didn't answer right away. Then she said, "I regret the hurt." "But not what came from it," he nodded. "Me neither." She took his hand and placed it on her belly, his breath hitched. "You sure?" he asked, voice barely above the wind. She nodded. "I've been sure for a few weeks now." He looked down, then back up, eyes shining. "You're not alone in it." "Not for a single minute." "I know," she said, and leaned into him. By the time spring came, the snow had melted into the earth, leaving behind soft patches of green and the scent of thawed pine. Bennett ran barefoot through the yard again, his laughter echoing off the hills. The cabin stood stronger than ever, its porch swept clean, its roof firm. Delaney sat in the rocker Dalton had built for her, one hand resting on the curve of her belly, the other holding a half-mended baby gown. Dalton was in the garden with Bennett, showing him how to tell a weed from a sprout. She watched them, her heart full but quiet. When Dalton finally came up the steps and sat beside her, she leaned into his shoulder. He kissed the top of her head. "You're tired." She looked up at him. "I'm content," he smiled. "That's better than rested." Inside, the fire crackled low and the scent of stew lingered. Outside, the last of the snowmelt ran down the ridge into the creek. Delaney closed her eyes. She had found not just survival, but peace. She had a son, a husband, and a home she had saved and rebuilt with her own hands. The past had not disappeared. But it no longer held her, it had led her here, and here she would stay. Beside the man who had seen her whole, with the love they had chosen day by steady day.